All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 13. I do want to clarify a couple things before I start the lecture. In Canvas, it says that you only have 14 weeks, but in reality, it's 15. We do have 2 weeks left in class, not one. So I need to just add another attendance component, or it's hidden. So we do have 2 more weeks. So that's the first thing. The second thing, as you know, through all the announcements, Maricopa Community Colleges has decided to go to a pass-fail grading model. Now, everything will be pass-fail as far as the courses, at least for the spring. So if you're concerned about grade point average or you're thinking about moving from your associates or your certification onto a 4-year degree, et cetera, you just have to formally request a grade to be the normal normal grade level report for the grade book. So you just have to send me a note or a message or an email. And basically I can essentially requested a letter grade, an actual ABC letter grade be associated with your course. Any questions about that? Are you speaking, Eric, or?
No, I was just taking things off mute. That's all.
Oh, okay. All right. All right. So let me go ahead and get into the lecture. We're going into triggers, using and managing triggers, module 13. So basically, triggers are another type of name block, and basically a trigger will fire. That's the verbiage based on actions that happen or an event that happens with a table of view schema, which is essentially the same, or essentially another layer of the database. So triggers do execute it implicitly, which means they fire based on other activities or other events. Whenever a particular DML or DDL event takes place. So you'll learn you learn about all the different triggers and what causes a trigger to fire and the steps required to create them and modify them, etc. And then you'll learn how to manage triggers, essentially viewing them in the data dictionary or as objects, altering their status, deleting them, etc. All of that fun stuff. So in this lesson, in lesson 1, it's an introduction to triggers. I'm going to describe database triggers and their uses, define a database trigger, and recognize the difference between the database, a database trigger and an application trigger. And just to give you a heads up, generally, most of the world, enterprise industry world, are using some type of trigger based on events happening in an application. So it's very, very common. So also in lesson 2, you're going to list 2 or more guidelines for using triggers and compare and contrast database triggers and store procedures. You know that they're different. All right, so let's get started. The purpose of this lesson, to reiterate, learning about triggers. Triggers allows specified actions to be performed automatically or on an automated basis within the database without having to write extra application code. Triggers increase the power and performance, and you learn more about triggers in the other lessons. And I think in this module we have 5 different lessons, so make sure you make your way through all of those. All right, so the need for a trigger this one is very, very basic. When you have a business rule that says whenever employee salary is changed, then the trigger should fire recording that change in a log table. That's just, it's one of the most common usages. So you can either create two procedures and call them, update employee salary, then log salary change, or you can just essentially, and then you would have to run both of those particular procedures. Whereas with a trigger, basically it will fire based on something that will happen in that particular table. So the two procedures aren't necessary. You can essentially use a trigger. So here's a very basic example. So essentially when or if we use the previous example about salary, basically the trigger will fire if anything changes or if that particular column changes in, let's say, the employees table. So to describe this example, so it's remember, it's just another named program. So create or replace trigger, and the trigger name is log salary change. After update, and I'll explain that, of salary on employees. So salary is the column, employees the table, and basically in the code, the executable block insert, you're just running an insert statement. So whenever this update occurs, then this trigger will fire updating this log table. Okay. And basically an event occurs and a trigger fires. That's essentially your association with a trigger. It's really pretty much that straightforward. So what is a trigger? It is a PL/SQL block. It's a name block. And it executes automatically whenever the associated action occurs. It's stored in the database. It is an actual object. And it's associated with a particular table or schema or view, which is essentially another table. So in an example, the previous example, basically our trigger will fire whenever the salary is updated on that employees table. So database triggers, once again, they execute automatically. They can fire on DML or DDL statements. And essentially, you don't have to write any extra code for the trigger to fire. Basically, when it's allocated as a trigger, essentially the trigger is listening for that event to occur. And database triggers are created and stored in the database, yes, as objects. And they're essentially stored in the same spot or the same way like procedures, functions, and packages. Application triggers execute, and this is a little bit different, and don't confuse the two, and you'll see that on a question or two. Application triggers are usually outside of the database, and basically they act the same way. You get something that happens within an application, and the trigger may fire to impact the data or perform some other function. But generally, it is associated with a database changing event.
I do have a question.
The
way the way these slides are basically, it's basically making the trigger sound. It's basically the trigger is created as if to to make not if but to make the code more efficient. But can a trigger also be used as somewhat like a kind of a check and balance in a way, such that, and I'll give an example, saying that if you're in database, you say that an employee that makes more than let's say makes more than $100,000. If that event happens, then it would be used almost as if like a safety saying, oh, we got an error, we have a mistake here, there's an error. Can it be used in that format?
Yes.
In that way?
Yes. So once again, yeah, absolutely. That's another way. A checks and balances is a perfect example of how a trigger can be useful, because basically it's like an auditing tool. If you set a threshold like that and you want some other action to happen, maybe you just wanted to send out a message or whatever, informing the accounting department or the human resources. Yes. So yes, that's a perfect example. Thanks, Eric.
Okay. Sure. Thank you.
Yeah. So the following events in the database, and these are actually events, will cause a trigger to fire. Operations, DML operations on a table view, and this is just a repeat, but basically anything that you can tie to within the database, including views that are data related or change of data related, will fire a trigger. Okay, so possible uses for triggers, create auditing records automatically, essentially similar to what Eric was asking, enforce complex data integrity rules. You see this all the time, data types, data size, and essentially a constraint, just to briefly explain, a constraint can prevent certain actions from happening, whereas a trigger can be truly like a checks and balance. It'll allow something to happen if that's what you want, and then the trigger will do something else to inform you. Creating logging records automatically, that's one of the higher usages. Preventing tables from being accidentally dropped. That is actually a system trigger, and you see that in applications as well. You always get to check, are you sure you want to delete? That's actually a trigger that's fired based on an application. And then to prevent invalid DML transactions from occurring. These are all very high uses of a trigger. You can also use a trigger to generate derived column values automatically. And this is getting into the more complex usages. Maintain synchronous table replication, gather statistics on table access. And a lot of these are actual triggers that you can enable on a system administration or database administrator level. Modified table data when DML statements are issued against views. So these are the more complex uses. You don't generally see these quite often. Generally, it is a logging and editing and checks and balances too. Right, so here's our first example, and this is just creating a logging record. The database administrator wants to keep an automatic record of who logs into the database. So you create this trigger, trigger log table, user ID, your variable login date, logon date, and whoops. So you create or replace a trigger. So that's a table. That's our log table. Where basically, when a user logs on, it basically writes a log with the date and the user ID in this log table. And those you have system functions, user and sysdate. You've seen these before, and it just basically captures the user that's logged in. And this trigger is actually running by default for the most part on Oracle. You can have access to that syslog table, and that's one component of it. All right, example 2, enforcing complex data integrity rules. If you read through this trigger, and I'll explain it before and what that means once we get through the examples. So create replace trigger, check salary trigger. This is essentially kind of like what Eric was referring to before. Update of a job ID on employees. For each role, declare this variable as an integer. Select count, basically from job history where employee ID is equal to the, and basically this is a rule that states no employee can have 2 jobs at the same time. All right, so guidelines for triggers. Do not define triggers to duplicate or replace actions. Yes, that's kind of a redundancy. You want the trigger to actually perform something different than the event. And you would think that would be common sense, but some usages of triggers are just to duplicate an action, and that's kind of a waste of resources. And literally, excessive use of triggers can result in very complex interdependencies, which will, bog down the database, et cetera. So you don't want to do anything like that. Use triggers only when necessary. Triggers are very, very nice to have, but remember, it should never be an all-inclusive process to have, one particular level of modification of your data and then a trigger to fire. Because what happens if you have a trigger firing every time you're managing and modifying your data, then obviously then your performance goes down. And generally, triggers are very short. They do something very straightforward. The simplest is usually creating a log or creating something like an audit trail. So. All right. So a quick comparison of database triggers to stored procedures. Triggers defined with create trigger, and you can read through these right quickly. Procedures, or create procedures, obviously. Triggers of data dictionary contains source code. Procedures data dictionary contains code and user source. User triggers is just defining where the triggers are stored versus the stored procedures. Triggers are implicitly invoked, which means they launch automatically, whereas procedures you have to explicitly invoke, you have to do the execute or call. The commit, save point, and rollback are not allowed in triggers, whereas you can have commit, save point, and rollback, those particular functions in a procedure. All right, so it seems like we missed something here. All right, so that's, sorry about this. That's kind of an introduction to triggers. Our terminology for lesson 1 was application triggers, database triggers, and just triggers. And you basically learn, I went over a description, a definition, recognize the difference between database trigger and application trigger briefly. List some guidelines for triggers and compare and contrast database triggers and store procedures. Okay. Okay, lesson 2, let's dig into triggers with a little more detail. Let's talk about creating a DML trigger. List of DML trigger components, create a statement level trigger, describe the trigger firing sequence options, which you're probably interested in that particular component. So suppose a user would like to keep an automatic record of the history of changes in employee salary. Once again, that's a scenario. This is not only important for business reasons, but it's required in many countries, which is true. So to do this, you can create a trigger. And DML triggers are just that. You know what DML is as far as the language. And they are the most common because that's generally when you're modifying the data and not modifying the database. Basically, in this lesson, we're going to learn how to create and use a DML trigger. So what is a DML trigger? It is associated with the insert, update, or delete. These are DML statements, and a DML trigger is associated with those. So a DML trigger is classified in 2 ways. Actually, it's 3 ways, technically. I put 2 ways there. So it's classified as a before and after and an instead of. Instead of is kind of a special case, and I'll talk about that. And it's classified by how many times the trigger executes or when the trigger executes. So once, I'm jumping ahead of myself. Rewind. Okay, so the classification of triggers, and and I'll explain this, sorry for the confusion. Triggers usually fire once, and just keep that in mind as far as DML triggers. So once for the whole DML statement, a trigger will fire just the one time based on the event. I always get a little bit scatterbrained about this. So let's talk about the sections of a create trigger or a DML statement. So you have the create trigger. You've seen this before, create or replace. Once again, it's another block. And then you have your trigger name, you have your timing, before, after, instead, and you have your event, which is usually the executable part of your, or the event, excuse me. It's usually one of the DML statements, instead, insert, update, and the update of, and I'll explain this in a few slides what that means, and delete. And then you have your object name, which is basically the table name that the trigger is associated with. And then you have your trigger body, which is the executable section, basically what are you going to happen within an anonymous block when the trigger fires. So trigger timing, I do want to talk about this. So you do have the three conditions. The before, when you allocate a trigger as before, it will fire before the event. The trigger fires essentially before the triggering DML event occurs in the table. So yeah, and it will make more sense once I go into an example as far as DML. And then there's an after association where the trigger fires after the event occurs. And then there's an instead of, and basically the trigger will fire instead of the DML event. And that can have its usages as well. So programming requirements will dictate, basically which one. And all that means is that you need to determine as the programmer or database administrator when the trigger should fire. Remember, for the most part, the trigger is not going to impact that particular table, but it's going to do something else. So, and I'll go into it more when we get to the examples. You'll see where it's important to understand based on the programming requirements when the trigger should fire. Okay, so the first trigger executes immediately before the employee salary is updated. So the way this trigger is written, create and replace trigger, salary update trigger, and you have the term before update of salary on employees. Now, this of here, you're actually focusing on one column, salary. Now you can take the of out and just before update on employees, and that will be associated with anything, the whole table, and then you would have to define what happens. So that's where you see this of, that's associated with a specific column. And then the second trigger executes immediately after an employee is deleted. So we're connecting this to the delete action. So after employees deleted, and we have whatever we're going to do with the trigger, whether it's a log, but whenever someone runs a delete statement on the employees table, then this trigger will fire. Okay. Questions?
I just had a quick one. So what we learned in the first section is basically states that a trigger takes place after an action is taken. So for the second example on the slide, that makes sense. Okay, you delete something, so that's an action. So therefore, the trigger would happen. But the first one to me doesn't make sense because you're saying before anything happens, the trigger will take some sort of action before you update. So how is that considered as an action?
Well, remember, let's say we want to know, remember, it's not going to impact the DML statement. It just will produce whatever we want it to produce before the actual update runs. And it's not like we're going to stop it or do some type of policing, but maybe we want, for whatever the programming reason, we want to trigger the fire before the action actually occurs. So there's a reason for that, and it could be just connected to some type of logging or some type of message that you're trying to create. Whoops. Hold on. Yeah, we're still here. So it's really a timing issue more than anything. Once again, you may want something to happen before the update occurs. Let's say you have a pretty complex update or a series of updates, of course, and you'll see in a minute, that particular first update, maybe you want to do something who knows, it could be anything, but that you would want to happen. This is all based on your desire. Go ahead.
Like a pre-check?
Maybe it could be a pre-check. Maybe it could be, yeah, see, a pre-check would be perfect, but maybe it's something else. And I'm being very vague because you can associate that with most anything. It truly depends on your your programming requirements there. But basically, it will tell you that. And remember, a trigger is going to fire, whether you want it to fire before or after. Um, and the special case is the instead of, and all that means is that if you have it, and we're getting to that, if you have it set as an instead of, then basically it will impact whether that particular action happens or not, or event happens or not.
Okay.
Okay, so trigger timing. An update trigger can be restricted to updates of a specific column. So let's say, for example, and this is why, let's say we're running a trigger so that salary column cannot be updated unless there's certain other conditions met, or so that's why you would have a before. You can actually create that in a program where basically it places a warning to the user that this particular column cannot be updated. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Okay. All right, so and instead of, well, we haven't gotten there yet. A trigger can have more than one triggering events. So you can actually put an after, insert, or delete, or update. So anything that happens to that table will fire this trigger, employee delete trigger. So you can have multiple triggers or more than one triggers on one event. So here's a little basically clarification. How often does a statement trigger fire, or how often does a trigger fire? A statement trigger fires only once each execution of the triggering statement, no matter how many rows are affected. So if the default type is the default type of DML trigger, is a statement trigger is useful if the trigger body does not exceed the process column values for. So basically, a statement trigger, the way it's allocated, you want to make sure that fires once, no matter what happens, so that whatever event you have, whatever process you have allocated within the trigger, you need to make sure that the user is aware that a trigger has fired. So that's what that means. Basically, if there's a statement that produces a message, etc., depending on what your program, what your purpose is, I should say. So how often does a statement trigger fire? So now we had built this trigger, after update, insert, basically when a user logs in. So the question is, how often does a trigger fire? When you update 10 rows, 1 row, or no rows, how many times does that trigger fire for those scenarios? And when does the statement trigger? Well, it only fires once. Just remember that, no matter whether it's a before or after, or if it's a combination. When something happens when you're running a DML statement and something happens to that table, then the trigger will fire unless you do something else. So this slide just shows essentially the firing sequence of the trigger for that table. So if it's a before trigger, it fires, if you're running an insert statement before the values are inserted, you see that there's department ID, et cetera. And then the after trigger fires after the data is inserted into the table. And as far as the update trigger, it's the same thing. If you have a before trigger, it'll fire before the updates occur, and after trigger will fire after. So this is just giving you a pictorial representation of basically what happens when we insert a row in this employees table. We do an insert into employees, et cetera. The data gets inserted. If we have an after trigger, then the trigger fires after the data is inserted. And that's what this is illustrating with our after trigger. So that example shows how DML triggers can be used to enforce complex rules if you have business rules. And basically, if you want to place that as a before, especially with inserts, and if you don't have certain constraints. So in this, for example, we're going to study this example that will not allow any updates or inserts in the employees table over the weekend. So basically, the only time that table can be modified is during the week, probably during work hours. So the way that we would write that trigger, basically it would look something like this: create a replace trigger, secure employees before the insert. Basically we're checking to see what the date is, the system date is, and then basically informing the user you cannot, if it's Saturday or Sunday, which is the end statement there, you're just stating you can't insert records into employees tables on the weekend. And so if we ran this trigger or we created this trigger and ran it like on a Saturday, the user would receive a message like this. It would look like an error, and it's basically a trigger, and it's essentially telling the employee that the user that the employee tables can only be updated during business hours during the week. So this trigger does not compile successfully. This is kind of a test question. Why not? So take a quick look at that before we lose the session. Yes, we'll lose the session. I will restart it. So just be patient. I still have to deal with this time limit. So take a quick look at that trigger. Why will that trigger not compile? If you was to enter that into your Oracle developer, it would give you an error. So what's wrong with that trigger? So I will come back. Once we come back into our session, we will dissect this trigger and see what's wrong with it.